My theory of change is that if we get a chance to get our heads together, it enables these kind of issues to come to more prominence in your own thinking. Then that makes it easier next time that you meet someone to be able to put a more informed point of view. It's only a small theory of change, but that's the rationale behind this group process. Okay, this table here. No, come up and use the microphone so the room can hear you and Jim can hear you.
So the table on the left, obviously this is not a fair summary of everything discussed, but there was an element of positive moves around young people and older people and everyone realizing that things have changed dramatically, about us relearning some, questions that we have already learned to address 100 years ago, sort of changing the industrial landscape, how we could have support throughout the community, engaging the community in different measures to help people thrive, especially the younger generations who obviously have less access to equity than their parents might have had. So I guess our questions are, one is for, we had Shelley, so we were sort of asking Mr. Stanford, one is around the innovation for unions, such as the affordability of unions. United Voice, how does the casual workforce access union resources and mobilize? Are there ways in which this has been done successfully, and we know and have studied that? And the second question was around the scale, because your presentation showed a scale of the employer on the left and the people in the union sort of being on equal footing once they're in an EBA or union negotiated workplace. And we were wondering whether that scale shouldn't still be giving the employer a much larger negotiation power than even the most unionized workplace can muster.
Yes, you're quite right on that score. The scale is, I drew it equal just to show that, with collective power, we've got a fighting chance, but you're quite right. The employers still have the ability to hire and fire. They have the decision-making power to invest and initiate production. So, I wouldn't pretend for a minute that simply unionizing will give us equal power with them. We would need a whole range of other measures in the areas of fiscal policy, industrial policy, expanding public sector activity to really get on an even footing with them. So I take your point 100%. In terms of the first question about innovation by unions, I think unions are doing their best to imagine ways that they can respond to the growth of insecure work or precarious work, the gig economy, and find other ways for members to connect with them. It is certainly possible in an appropriate institutional structure for unions to do a good job representing the collective interests of gig workers and digital workers and other types of new work in this economy. For example, there's a very recent union contract that was signed in Denmark between a union and a whole group of platform workers that shows that gig workers can indeed have the benefits of collective power, but that's in a context in Denmark where unions are recognized, legitimated, well-funded, and have legal and political power. So I think, in order for those innovations to really bear fruit, we've got to address that fundamental issue about unions' role in society and win the public debate to ensure that unions are given the legitimacy and status and funding base that they require. So I have no doubt that unions are capable of innovating, but we do have to address the uniquely anti-union culture and legal environment in Australia if those innovations are going to bear fruit.
I'll be sort of attempting to interpret the discussion into a question. Jim, I think we had a question about the tax levers, wasn't it, gentlemen? There was Sorry.
It's okay, just keep the microphone up.
Oh, sorry. Jim, we're wondering if you had any thoughts about using the tax system in relation to the wealth, distribution of wealth that's emerged. Is that a reasonable question, gents? Yeah.
Well, certainly the tax system plays a really important role in moderating the inequality that is produced in the market economy. And that happens certainly in terms of income. As long as we preserve a progressive tax system and then preserve the provision of public services and income support payments from that tax system, then the tax and transfer process substantially reduces inequality. In Australia's case, for example, the inequality of after-tax, after-transfer income is about half the level of inequality of pure market incomes. So that shows how important it is to preserve a progressive tax system and the social programs that are funded from it. So it's no coincidence that the coalition government wants to do away with the progressive tax system, as we've seen with the latest measures on the personal tax side, to flatten the tax system all the way up to $200,000 annual income, which is incredible, and also cut taxes on big companies, which ultimately benefits the people who own those companies. In terms of wealth inequality, the tax system once played that role when we had taxes on wealth, whether that was an annual tax on wealth or an inheritance tax. Those have been pretty much done away with. Thomas Piketty, the famous French economist who's such an expert on inequality, has proposed a wealth tax as a way of addressing inequality. Obviously, the rich and powerful would fight very, very, very hard against that, but we should still throw that idea out. So in general, I think the tax system can play a helping role, but I do think that we need to also work to redistribute income at the pre-tax level. And that's where I think unions come in. We should be able to increase the equality of income even before the tax and transfer system comes into play. And that's where the role of unions and collective bargaining, in my view, is so important.
You were talking about the ALP to begin with.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground, sorry folks. So we started off talking about the ALP's role in, pushing down wages under the Accord, and the unions, I guess agreeing to that, and that was really sort of the start of the decline that had been mentioned. We didn't really get anywhere with that other than feeling a bit disheartened about that and thinking about how that's contributed to the problem. Then we started talking about the Whitlam era and Whitlam's incredible investment into community infrastructure, and how that actually contributed to communities feeling like they had control over what was going on in their communities and empowerment. And then we started talking about the impact of neoliberalism on breaking all of that down in the Victorian context particularly. Then we started talking about, if unions are kind of the collective support position, if you like, for workers, where's the collective support position for the vulnerable? There's a lot being done to care for them as individuals, and there's good work being done in terms of caring in place, but who's kind of doing any work at all around activism? And again, we talked about community development was a practice, I suppose, that was championed under the Whitlam government, that I suppose was decimated in terms of its political effect under neoliberalism. And just how important it might be to really try and go back to community activism and teaching people how to become activists and have a voice.
Well, I remember very well the 10th Family Project by the Brotherhood, and a number of people enrolled in community development. I would have liked to have seen a couple of them standing for Parliament, but it didn't happen. And once people are working, they're working. I mean, it's changed their lives, but what about the lives of their neighbours and the rest of the people, in the flats in Brunswick Street? At the time of following Whitlam during the late 70s, just in this kind of neighbourhood, we had Shelter Victoria started from scratch. We had community health from scratch. Now it's part of Yarra. And there were all kinds of activism involved with that. We had legal advice and service, not legal aid, but legal service at community level. We had a very vigorous tenants union. I mean, all of those things started in a measure of half a decade. They were all, they've all gone to water in different ways. Neighbourhood houses, we have 380 in Victoria. The only state that has further education delivered from those places. In the first decade, it had 200,000 enrolments, out of, from zero up, and it all becomes very bureaucratized. It all becomes, we are so busy accounting for what we do that there is no room for anything else. When it comes to the relationship with unions, there needs to be an exploration of different ways to relate between unions and membership, the actual membership or the potential membership. Yeah, I would like to see unions where they organize my travel, that have community health centers, that have access, scholarships and so on, access to education for the disadvantaged. Then you need your union. You have to talk to it every day. Instead, there is a big chasm.
You had a question. I guess following on from what we're saying. So I guess the question is, what do you feel the possibility is for, say, the non-government sector to become more supportive of activism and organising activism for disenfranchised people, and kind of move more into that space as opposed to kind of doing, the acute responsive care role?
So I think actually it's already happening, and it's happening in a number of ways, and through different means. So with the in the mental health sector, there's been an incredible emphasis, and to some degree the drug and alcohol, and to some degree the homelessness sector over the last few years, 5 to 10 years. Incredible emphasis on people who've had lived experience of their circumstances being engaged for their advice, to be involved in influencing agenda, to be involved in the design of services, in the practices of those services. That's one form of it happening. Another form of it happening, for example, if I just take an example of the Brotherhood's work around building the capability of young people, and particularly homeless young people or young people in and out of work, for example, that takes a capabilities approach. One of the core elements that's stepped out in that approach is campaigning. And so it's because of this whole notion that we're trying to enable people to recognise their choice and agency and freedom. So campaigning and encouraging young people themselves to be active in campaigning for change is an integral part of the actual design of the service delivery. I think there are other mechanisms in which it's happening too that aren't actually started by the not-for-profit sector themselves. It's started by the people themselves. And so I was saying on my group, I actually feel quite optimistic, strangely enough, and I can be the opposite, but I actually feel quite optimistic that people are rediscovering the importance of community activism, community engagement, and it's being spurred a bit by things like the National Disability Insurance Scheme, for which people are being encouraged to have choice and control and agency. There's problems with the scheme in its implementation, but there are some glorious principles in it, in which people with disability are absolutely seizing on, and seizing their rights delivered under the Act within that scheme. So I'm actually feel quite encouraged that activism's happening. It's alive and well, and particularly among certain groups of young people and others.
So unsurprisingly, we spoke about all the issues which have already been covered by the first three groups. So I'll try not to repeat and cover the different areas. So we spoke about the need for people to be able to participate in the economy and to have skills, experience, and networks, and the importance of them. And we spoke about changing forms of labour patterns, and when we're talking about collective bargaining, it's how difficult that is in an economy where the collective can sometimes be just one person working on their own as an independent contractor, and just how difficult it is to get that type of bargaining, particularly in the gig economy. And we spoke about what unions might be doing to combat that, and some examples were given, which was interesting. And we spoke about the continued impact on the media and how and people's perceptions of the unemployed, and how we need to battle that, and how unemployed people can be unfairly stigmatized. We didn't really get to a question, so I've scribbled down one of my own, so I'll apologize to the group and just ask it anyway. But I mean, clearly there's a lot of angry people out there who want change, people who are feeling left behind in the changing world with poorly paid jobs, who are unemployed or underemployed. How do we stop that from leading to Trumpism and Hansonism and the rise of other kind of more right-wing political responses, which will just lead to more of the same?
Just to the first part of the comment about the difficulties of setting up collective bargaining for independent workers, such as in the gig economy or other people who work by themselves, there are certainly some challenges, but there's a long history of union organizing among independent workers or dependent contractors in areas like trucking or harvesters or fishing, where it really does matter your collective power. Even if you're strictly, in a technical way, self-employed, you still have to organize to get collective power in terms of the arrangements you have with the people who buy your product and so on. So I think there's a long history of finding ways to do that, and I think it absolutely can be done in the gig economy too. It just requires an appropriate institutional framework that allows workers to do that. And one of the dimensions of repression we experience in Australia is in fact an outright prohibition on collective bargaining by so-called independent contractors, where in other countries they have the right to come together and try to get a better deal from the larger firms that they all work for. So I think there's a lot of potential, but it does require some change. You're quite right about the risks of the anger that's out there. That anger is legitimate. People have absolutely had the dream of inclusive prosperity ripped away from them over the last generation. We now have a generation whose kids are not going to be better off than they are, and many of them will be worse off. And there's a huge anger there, and I think it's crucial for the left to be there with, first of all, a convincing explanation of why they're experiencing that hardship, to root it in the failures and the power imbalances of neoliberalism, and then provide a hopeful and constructive alternative for that anger to come out. Because otherwise, you're quite right, the wounds will fester and become infected with racism and xenophobia, as we've seen elsewhere. So we have to be very ambitious in both explaining the problem and leading a progressive solution.
Yeah, I would obviously endorse what Jim has to say about recognition of people's circumstances, because without recognition of it and also a recognition of their value and contribution to the community, then that creates either depression or anger or and a fragmentation. So I think recognition and finding vehicles to do that. Research is one way of doing it, and exposing what people's circumstances, but it's not the only way to do it. I think there are other ways and we can give expression to people's circumstances, whether it's through forms of social media or other platforms for doing it. I think what it requires, however, is an investment by government, but not only, to recognise and create opportunities for people left behind in the gig economy or the insecure work economy, if you like. And I think we have to be arguing, as Jim says, for progressive solutions in relationship. But it's not only government's responsibility. I think it's our personal responsibility to do whatever we can. It's the responsibility of government, it's the responsibility of philanthropy, it's the responsibility of business and local government as well. And so I think we have to be inviting those people into the conversation about the experiences of those left behind. Moreover, and then creating solutions in which we create opportunities for those people to be included in forms of participation, whether it's economic or whether it's social. And I think there are models of doing that that have been highly successful in local communities or regional communities. So I don't think that we don't have some of the answers to that. I just think we need to have the political will and the personal will and the collective will of the not-for-profit sector as well to actually take those solutions up to government or to others who can fund them.
We'll give it a shot. It's going to be revolution by committee. The team very much enjoyed the talks first up, so thank you very much for your time, Shelley and Jim. Some things were reflected on that haven't been addressed so far. Hopefully I can target them well. Especially liked your economic argument for unionism, Jim. Of course there's a moral underlay between any economic argument, but typically unions are argued for perhaps solely from a moral standpoint. The encroachment of the profit sector into social services was very much a concern for our group. Any successful future union arrangement might be contingent upon workers and management engaging with each other more effectively, as in Scandinavian countries and also Germany. And more broadly across both talks, there was a theme that was picked up on, and maybe this goes beyond unions, that we don't have a vision, as we're seeing maybe in the UK and the US, of a party that can represent these values and what needs to be done. Maybe it's a party that isn't afraid of the term socialism. So 3 questions, 2 for Jim. We see in a lot of your graphs, Jim, that there is a distinct change in the early 80s, late 70s, when neoliberalism sort of kicked in. Is it important for us to explain what prompted that reaction? Inflation was high in the 70s. There was an oil shock as well. Wonder if you could elaborate on some of those conditions maybe. And also in your graph regarding the proportion of wealth owned by the top 1%, to what degree do you think technological contributions to value creation versus that of humans are a relevant variable to consider? Sorry for the wonkish question, people who aren't economists. And Shelley, do we need to frame social services in terms of human capital more, in terms of to promote a value argument?
So I think one of the things I was trying to say gently is that there's limitations to the human capital argument, about how to enable people to thrive. And we're already seeing the limitations in some senses of the human capital agenda, which is not to say I think we should throw it out. I don't. I just think in and of itself, human capital is not going to solve the issue of inequality as we see the sort of changing nature of the labour market and the meaning of work changing in this modern economy. So I guess my answer to the question is that you need human capital development and giving people the opportunity to develop their talents and abilities and skills and the broadest possible ones of those, because we can see in the changing economy that we're going to need a range of skills. Everyone's not agreed on what they are. Some of them are intensely practical, some of them are problem solving, some of them are communication and networking skills as well. So clearly that's going to be really important for people if they're to secure a sort of a sustainable foothold in decent work. But human capital alone, you need money, and you need access to it, a basic level of income, so that you can survive, and you need, of course, connections to people, different forms of connections, of sociality, of basic human kindness, as well as connections that are going to enable you to secure the things that you need to live a decent life. So I think to privilege human capital at the expense of the other capitals would be a mistake, and would compromise a kind of principle and rights-based agenda.
Thank you and hi. I'll keep this really briefly. Shelley, our question to you was about agency. We were quite confused about what agency is and how it's relevant to policy, and we're hoping that you could speak to that, particularly in light of the examples of the two young men. And Jim, we talked also about your presentation, and this is a question for me, and it's a curiosity I've had for a while, which is, when you look at those kind of various Vs that you had, that those Vs coincide with women's labour force participation, and I'm really curious if there's a kind of gendered story in this at all.
I do not think that women's labour force participation explains the shift in labour share of GDP. If anything, more women joining the labour force should increase labour's share of GDP, because you'll have more of the population working. There's certainly a gendered dimension to neoliberalism and its effects, a very strong gender dimension to the rise of insecure work and part-time work, where employers are taking advantage of the fact that women disproportionately do the carrying labor at home, and try to justify the shift towards part-time work and insecure work on those grounds, rather than providing women and families with the high-quality childcare and other social supports that would allow full labour force participation by women. So there's certainly a gender dimension to the story, but I wouldn't explain that overall trend, that whole sea change, on the basis of women's labour force participation. The countries that have the highest labour force participation, in fact, are in many cases the ones that have preserved the labour share of GDP and the power of unions most effectively, such as the countries in Scandinavia.
I guess the emphasis on, there's a lot of unpacking to do about agency, but in brief, it's obviously an idea about having the capacity to act on your own or others' behalf. However, when you look at the idea about agency in other cultural contexts, that people talk about, that there are always enabling conditions for agency, enabling relationships, and so that you act in relation to. Why do we think that, or why do think that agency is so critical in this discussion around enabling people to access opportunity? Because we think that it's very important that people exercise their freedom, actually, to make choices about what they want to be and do, and that we need to create the enabling conditions for that, and where they don't exist, people don't have the freedom to do things that they want to be and do. But if they don't have those levels of choice and voice and capacity to act, then we don't think that the outcomes for those people will necessarily be as good than they otherwise would be. And in the story of James and Nick, of course, both of them in varying ways have exercised their capacity to act, but they've also both been constrained in certain ways as well.
Thank you very much for your presentations tonight. They were really good. Just in terms of, just to shortcut some of the points we raised, we raised the issues, some of the structural issues about the definitions, but most particularly about even statistics, about the false positives that it creates. For example, the way unemployment is measured in this country, and the issue about wages, where we smashed the wage inflation, but we've created, either intended or unintended, the issue about wage deflation, etc. So the questions that we sort of came to were the macro questions about how do we get both your presentations tonight, stamp manifesto over it, and present it to the political elite, the political classes, and all the stakeholder groups that form part of the political system. How do we get them to not just listen, because I think they probably are listening, but they're not listening intently. How do we get them to actually act and implement? And then a subset of that question is then the issues that you've already touched on and everyone else has touched on tonight about the institutional frameworks, the institutional structures. How do we re-engage? How do we reinforce? How do we recapitalise the economics of those institutions, economics in its most broadest sense, the social capacity, the organisational capacity, the financial capacity of unions, of community groups, of social welfare organisations to come together. Has the horse already bolted? Is it too late? Is there an opportunity? How do you do it? So the question is, everything that you both have said tonight was, I think there was universal agreement, certainly at our sample, and I'm sure across the room. How do we then get the next step is, how do we implement it? Thank you.
So many sort of ways to answer that question, so many levels in which you implement it. So I think there's levels in which you can implement these sets of ideas at the level of the individual. And by that I mean the practice around what you do and say and leverage for and with individuals. In the not-for-profit space, how do you take some of these ideas and implement them in program design and policy design? And what I would say is some of this is already happening in small ways and in big ways, and you do it by forming partnerships and coalitions and alliances with people, and then from that work demonstrating its efficacy or not, and taking it into the political and policy domain. But you can, I don't really know how to answer that in a sensible way. Yeah.
I do not think it is too late. I don't think anyone in this room thinks it's too late. Otherwise, we wouldn't have given up this lovely evening to come to this meeting and put the energy and hope that we do into building a progressive movement. I don't think there's a magic bullet answer to how we get the word out and how we build awareness. I follow the old activists' adage: educate, organize, mobilize. And we're doing some of the education tonight. I'm very encouraged, as I mentioned in my presentation, by the Change the Rules campaign that the ACTU and its affiliates is undertaking. I think it has tremendous potential to do even better than the old Your Rights at Work campaign did over a decade ago, to change the public discussion, to ratify the anger that workers feel, but then direct that anger in a positive direction. So nothing other than hard work, thinking of ways to get the message out, and then thinking of ways to mobilize people so that their collective power is felt by those in power. I don't think we'll ever convince them of our views, but we can certainly force them to acknowledge our views.
Thanks.
Guess,
Mark? Go on.
Just got one more comment to make about it. I think the lesson that we all need to learn is to move over and give a space and a place for the people for who are experiencing the most levels of disadvantage. And I think in our activism, that's going to be absolutely critical. So I take that to heart in terms of, as a researcher, as a person in the policy domain, a person who dabbles in the practice and program domain, that to progress an activist agenda within that space, other voices need to be heard and not mine.
Thank you both. I have a majority report and a minority report. I won't go over all the points at our table because they've been mentioned, but there were a couple of there the majority, not me, but the majority thought both of you are on the right track. But not covered enough is how and why unemployment or employment has changed, and the question of 457 visas, neither of you mentioned that 2/3 of new jobs in Australia go to people on 457 visas. That's full and part-time employment, and 70% of full-time jobs go to people on 457 visas. So there's bugger all left for the unemployed here in Australia. Now, Minority Report, very quickly. I am different from you two. I start from my reality. If I want to achieve equality in society, my reality is different. I start from reality. The reality is today that neither of you have been honest about the real unemployment figures, which, according to Adam Creighton of The Australian, which is hardly a left-wing paper, is 15% unemployed and another 5% underemployed. Now, I have sent to you, both of you, my paper on this, and neither have you replied. And my understanding is, if you are in the welfare or think tank area and you criticise government on that, Labor or Liberal, you'll get a funding cut. The second reality is, and as hard as it is, the Federal Labor Party is corrupt. It's run by millionaires for millionaires. Tanya Plibersek, Albo, $800,000 a year income. When they retire, they'll get $6 million in their pension fund. A pension of $200,000 a year. They don't give a stuff. They don't give a stuff about the unemployed. When they were in office last, they voted not to increase the value of the dole. They voted to tighten up on the ZSP. So even if you've got 1 foot in the grave, you can't get it. They voted to offload sole parents from their pension of $21,000 a year to $14,000 a year. So finally, Jim had mentioned the Accord, but you haven't mentioned, neither of you, free trade and the open slather. The question is, why haven't you covered the topics I mentioned?
Thank you for the comment about the unemployment figures, and you've raised that with me before. That's quite right. And
but no reply.
And I did have a reply in person, and I'll give you the same reply, which is well, 2 replies. Not the topic tonight, not the focus, on unpacking the figures, the unemployment figures. However, I think what you have been trying to do, and I agree with it. You're raising an issue about the definition of unemployment as it's measured internationally and nationally. At 1 hour's work a week that constitutes employment, and Blind Freddie can think that just is ridiculous. That you can be deemed employed if you've got 1 hour a week. So I don't take issue with you. In fact, I can see that what that does is mask the lived experience of people of underemployment and unemployment. So I don't take issue with you at all about that one.
Yeah, I agree both with the speaker and with Shelley. The official unemployment rate is not a valid indicator of the degree of desperation in Australia's labour market, and I actually agree. I think the true unemployment rate is around 15% once you include involuntary part-time work, people who've given up looking, and marginally attached workers who would work if they thought that a job was available. So the official unemployment rate is not a valid indicator of how the labour market is doing, absolutely.